Hello, patrons and general audience members. Welcome to another Books That Burn essay by Robin. Thank you to Case Aiken, who receives a monthly patron shoutout. This is the second in a 5-part essay series discussing two long-running book series by queer authors, Daye by Seanan McGuire and Inheritance by A.K. Faulkner. I chose these series because I love them both. They were intended from the start to be long series. Neither of them are finished yet, and the authors have different structural approaches to developing each series across so many volumes. Purely coincidentally, they are both long-running contemporary fantasy series, mainly set in California in or near the 2010s, with major characters named Quentin, and whose fast-healing protagonists have a tendency to quasi-adopt a gaggle of magical teenagers. After a brief moment in the 1990s, Daye begins in earnest in 2009 and has reached 2015 as of the 18th book, while Inheritance is ambiguously set in the mid to late 2010s. Each of my essays focuses on a particular topic of importance to long series such as these two. They're designed to be intelligible on their own and can theoretically be read in any order, but most readers will have the best experience if they start with the first essay and proceed linearly. Series structure, series arcs, and monsters of the week. This essay spoils major elements of the first 10 books of the Inheritance series by A.K. Faulkner, as well as the first 6 books in the Daye series by Seanan McGuire, while lightly discussing some spoilers from later books in that series. It touches briefly on themes of murder and death, as well as alluding to fictional depictions of kidnapping, torture, and harm to children. When writing a long series, there are two structural questions which will affect each reader's experience, regardless of whether the author plans them or lets them unfold naturally. What is the series like for new readers, and what is it like for longtime readers? Series arcs and Monster of the Week stories can provide satisfying solutions to shape these experiences for all readers. The combination of gradual changes and impermanent characters enliven each series, making new books meaningful and stopping them from being wholly interchangeable with the books around them. Both are used to great effect by Seanan McGuire in her Daye series and by A.K. Faulkner in their Inheritance series. What is a Monster of the Week? Long series with more than one narrative arc planned or in progress need something to differentiate each entry from the others, something which is the focus of that particular story. In TV shows, this is sometimes known as the Monster of the Week, where there's some problem to solve, usually logistically, e.g. killing or otherwise dealing with a monster, which appears for that episode and then is gone by the next week's story. In a long-running book series such as Inheritance and Daye, there generally is something happening which the characters deal with in each book, some focus around which the plot can revolve. These moments are what make the time shown in the book worthy of being in the narrative, something different than when the characters implicitly exist and live their lives in the moments between stories worthy of a reader's attention. A shorter series like a duology or trilogy can ensure that every conflict matters very specifically to the main arc of the story, but this would be unworkable for a longer series. When following characters for a long time, it's important to have narrative rest, to have crises which can arise and then actually be resolved, even if the damage done and any lessons learned take longer to settle down. Whether they're handled forever or just for now is something only time and more books will tell. For my purposes, a Monster of the Week in a long book series is a problem, monster, or antagonist who has not been a significant issue in any earlier books, or has been quiescent for a long time between distinct appearances, is relevant for a single book, then is defeated and either killed or otherwise removed, not an active player in the next several books, if they're still alive or revivable, or gone forever if they're permanently dead, An early story's monster of the week might be some more durable villain later, but a reappearance doesn't necessarily recharacterize their debut. Structurally, Monsters of the Week help provide focus to individual books. This is important in a long series to maintain individuality for each entry. It also provides opportunities, whether or not the author chooses to accept them, for villains or monsters to actually get defeated or forced to realign to help the protagonists in the future. The slightly reduced menu of baddies can be more developed and thus more interesting because the narrative focus in the longer term isn't diluted between a dozen villains. This need changes, however, for extremely long series like decades-long manga or superhero comics, with no planned end in sight and a need to keep their options open. Neither Inheritance nor October Daye are that kind of series, however. They need to keep a lid on just how many actively hostile forces are running around after their first confrontation with the heroes. Foes can become friends to the protagonists or end up dead, and both these series do a fair share of each. Monsters in Inheritance. Inheritance is organized into a planned 5 seasons of 5 books each. In the first book, Jack of Thorns, the antagonist is Jack, an entity who claims to be a god, heavily implies that he is Lawrence's deity, and demands that Lawrence provide him with sexual energy to sustain him. Lawrence might not have an objection to any sex he may have, incidentally helping his god, but there's a major problem. The only options Lawrence can imagine when Jack arrives on the scene are Quentin, the hot British guy who's terrified of sex and whom Lawrence doesn't want to scare off, and Dan, Lawrence's ex-boyfriend who has already tried to assault him. Good news for Lawrence and Quentin, neither Jack nor Dan survive the first book's events and are cemented as the first monsters of the week. Jack, in particular, would be an existential threat to Lawrence in the short term and the city of San Diego in the longer term if not stopped, but because he is killed here, he is instead an early casualty of the narrative need to tie up loose ends so they don't clog the series. Emotionally, Jack and Dan linger, particularly in Lawrence's thoughts. Jack taught Lawrence the main method he uses for seeing the future. Sometimes using his gift brings up thoughts of the erstwhile god. For his part, Dan was Lawrence's boyfriend before he became a stalker with aspirations towards assault, and that specter is not so easily shed. The second book, Night of Flames, is paired with the fourth, Reeve of Veils. They cover the same period of time from 2 different sets of perspectives. Quentin and Lawrence are the focus of Night of Flames, with Quentin's twin, Freddie, showing up early on to try and get Quentin to return home as their father demands. That sets up some threads for the arc of Season 1, but Freddie's attempt to quickly deliver a plea is stymied by Quentin's refusal to return and the appearance of this week's monster, Kane Wilson. Kane is a psychic with the ability to control people with his voice, and he lives in a mansion with a bunch of teenagers and a couple of bodyguards, all of whom have psychic abilities. Psychic in this series is a catch-all term for a particular kind of inherent ability, which is distinct from either magic spells or demigod powers. Kane needs to be known as awesome and powerful. He revels in the control he exerts over others with just his voice. It becomes obvious that he's the antagonist when it turns out that Kane has been responsible for a series of brutal murders over the years, beginning when he was a teen himself, driving first his childhood bullies and then his adult adversaries to messy deaths, sometimes at their own hands, always against their will. While the fourth book is fascinating from a series structure standpoint, it is not really a Monster of the Week story, nor does it need to be. Reeve of Veils reveals that Freddie, who was so helpful in the second book, was actually up to more than either Quentin or Lawrence could have guessed. In particular, he came across and then entered into a relationship with Mikey, Lawrence's former dealer. Mikey was in some of Lawrence's visions and relevant whenever Lawrence spoke of his heroin use, but Mikey himself first appears here. Reeve of Veils focuses mainly on what Freddie was working on in the background of Night of Flames through a mix of retold scenes from Freddie's perspective instead of Lawrence or Quentin, or wholly new scenes with Mikey or Freddie when Quentin and Lawrence were not present. It also transpires that Freddy is a telepath, which recharacterizes his few interactions with Kane Wilson in Night of Flames. This information was revealed at the end of Night of Flames, but this is the first time the implications are explored in any depth. Freddy finds Kane to be uninspired and petty, and Kane's powers don't actually work on him. To Freddy, Kane is a problem mostly because Freddy needs to avoid revealing his telepathy to Quentin, since Quentin is as immune to Freddy's telepathic influence as both twins are to Kane's. Once Freddy learns of Lawrence's ability to look into the past, he also must limit his outward actions so they don't condemn him if viewed by Lawrence in the future. If Freddy had encountered Kane on his own, he would have either ignored him entirely or dealt with him easily. Instead, constrained by a need to hide his abilities from his brother in the present and from Lawrence's scrying in the future, Freddy moves more carefully, limiting his overt actions. To view Reeve of Vales as a monster of the week story would necessitate viewing Freddy as the monster in the other men's story. And that's certainly a plausible reading. Ultimately, I don't hold with that lens, since even as Freddy causes trouble for Quentin and Lawrence, he does so in ways that are more closely tied to the larger season, not restricted to this one entry. Circling back to the third book, Lord of Ravens focuses at first on Lawrence and Quentin as a couple sharing intimacy. After Lawrence looks into the past to find out the reason for Quentin's scars, the tone pivots sharply onto Lawrence's new horror at certain aspects of Quentin's backstory and other things related to Quentin's abusive father, the Duke of Oxford. Before that can be resolved, a creature, Black Annis, appears and kidnaps one of the children, declaring that she will take a child every day until Quentin does what his father wants: come home and learn magic. If he does not come in a week, she will eat the children she has taken. While the Duke is pulling the strings, there is a very literal monster at hand, and defeating her doesn't resolve the larger issue of the Duke's attempts to exert control over Quentin's life and his willingness to harm children in pursuit of his goals. Likewise, because Black Annis is just this book's monster and not a season-long threat, stopping her doesn't change the longer-term issue of the Duke and his drive to control his children's lives for the sake of his legacy. The fifth book, Page of Tricks, is literally a season finale, bringing together Lawrence, Quentin, Freddy, Mikey, and the Duke into one country when Freddy kidnaps Lawrence at the Duke's orders and brings him to England, forcing Quentin to follow in order to get him back. While the third and fourth books are tied very strongly to these events, the first and second retain their Monster of the Week qualities even in retrospect. The Duke was wholly unaffiliated with Jack, Dan, and Kane, and even his use of Black Annis was deployed in a manner which continued the episodic feeling of the early season. The first three books see their antagonists die. Technically, the fourth does as well, but I'm disinclined to credit Kane's death a second time, placing them outside of any reasonable chance at reappearance. Where things get very interesting for this week's monsters is in Season 2, when it appears at first that a string of very bizarre situations and antagonists are completely unrelated, only for it to turn out that a villain was pulling the strings to make those problems happen now instead of later or never. The reader, privy to the epilogues, was alerted to this connection from the start, but Lawrence and Quentin initially have no idea. In Book 6, Rites of Winter, a black dog appears and takes Quentin to Onwin in Otherworld. The warlock who summoned the dog was trying to test Lawrence, but because the rest of the story takes place in Otherworld, the warlock didn't get most of the information he wanted and needed to try something else. In the seventh book, Sigils of Spring, that something turned out to be sending a person naturally immune to both powers and magic to kidnap Quentin, forcing Lawrence into action once again. While technically the warlock doesn't send the memory-erasing entity into action for Spells of Summer, Book 8, its interference is caused indirectly by things he set in motion years ago, coming to a head because he recently sent his daughter into Lawrence's path as a magic teacher. The ninth book, Runes of Fall, brings trouble from a group of demigod Nazis whose leader can't stand that his daughter ran away rather than stay home and be a superpowered racist. She had run away very successfully until the warlock sent her current whereabouts to a member of her father's group, putting danger once more in Quentin's and Lawrence's path as she is under their protection. Wheel of Fate, Book 10, wraps up the season with a confrontation between the warlock and our merry band of protagonists, this time with some help from those who have been more ambiguously aligned in the past. Monsters in October Daye. The October Daye series follows October Toby Daye, changeling and bloodworker, the de facto investigator of strange things due to her current position as someone who grew up partially in the mortal world and partially in the Summerlands. A not uncommon situation for those who are part mortal, part fae, and chose fairy. She is a private investigator in the mortal world, it pays the rent and grocery bills, and is called upon more and more to apply those same skills to strange happenings among the fae. This is a perfect setup for a plethora of Monster of the Week stories, and this series has plenty, including 2 of the early entries, a local habitation and an artificial night. A local habitation is the second book in the series, sending Toby to the county of Tamed Lightning to check on her liege's niece, January Torquil, whose normally regular communications to her uncle, Sylvester Torquil, have ceased. When Toby arrives with Quentin in tow, they discover that January thinks her uncle is the one who stopped taking her calls, and she's been trying to reach him for weeks about a series of strange deaths in the county. A local habitation is a murder mystery in a restricted setting, and the antagonist is eventually discovered and killed. It's also a perfect Monster of the Week story, especially this early in the series. Toby doesn't know any of the residents of Tamed Lightning, and thus has few preconceptions as to who the murderer could be. It's a genuinely twisty mystery, deeply engaging on a first read-through with a pretty satisfying resolution. Monster of the Week stories don't have to be deeply relevant to the main saga, but they are better contributors to the overall series when they continue to matter even on rereads. In the course of trying to find and stop the murderer, Toby meets several characters who will be important in later books, as well as demonstrating her magical prowess in a manner which is inconsistent with her current understanding of herself as a Donya Shi changeling. An Artificial Night, Book 3, begins with a string of disappearances of fae and mortal children. Toby is first alerted when 2 of her friend Stacy's children go missing in the middle of the night, and a third has fallen into a deep sleep and won't wake up. Before she can get much information, Tybalt, the local king of cats, appears and asks for help, telling Toby that a number of Kathashi children are missing. Finally, Quentin arrives on her doorstep, distraught that his mortal girlfriend Katie has disappeared. All the children turn out to have been kidnapped by this week's monster, Blind Michael, who rides with his wild hunt, breaking mortal children into steeds and twisting fae children into riders. Changeling children, partly fae, partly mortal, could be either rider or ridden depending on some combination of factors, which mostly remained unexplained but are implied to be a mix of magic and will. Blind Michael's hunt is the narrative lever by which many pieces are moved into place for later in the series. After this book, he matters most for the hurt he caused and what it means that Toby kills him, a firstborn. Toby becomes very attached to some of the children she rescues, including Raj, a prince of cats, who normally would have never come into contact with someone like Toby, aligned as she is with the divided courts. Later on, once Quentin is officially her squire, Raj will be her squire in all but name, friends with his fellow teenagers, and a frequent guest on October's couch. The wild hunt, the stories of the ride, and the ritual needed to break it will be relevant again much later, but for now, their terror ended, as Blind Michael will ride no more. Series arcs. There is no one right way to structure an ongoing series, but McGuire and Faulkner have chosen different structural approaches for handling the same narrative need, balancing the ability to introduce new readers to a series in progress with building an ongoing story for continuing readers. McGuire favors a series of overlapping narrative arcs, such as in her October Daye series, while Faulkner's Inheritance series is organized into fixed-length seasons. Despite this initial structural difference, they both use a pattern which is beneficial for long series, one which furnishes new readers with periodic entry points without retreading ground in a way that might be frustrating to longtime readers. This structure is as follows. Initial setup, small resolutions, heightened stakes, plateau, inflection point, larger resolutions, then a new entry point replaces the initial setup and the cycle continues with small resolutions. Sometimes more than one book holds a specific stage, or something like the plateau can get skipped in service of the larger story, or in a deliberate attempt to deny the characters time to rest and assimilate recent events. However, this pattern holds enough to be a guide to understanding why certain kinds of events happen how they do, and which books are friendlier to new readers once the series gets going. Arc, Structure, and October Daye. The October Daye series is structured in overlapping narrative arcs, which generally follow this loop. Sometimes more than one book will linger in the stages for plateau or larger resolutions, but the other stages tend to be restricted to one book in each cycle. Early on, a stage may get skipped or combined in a single book with another stage, but the general order is consistent. Fairly early on, the series began to include a novella with each main book, which often takes care of small resolutions tied to the main story, freeing up the next book to take on one of the other stages unencumbered. In a long series, this cycle accomplishes several important things at once. By having new entry points after each large resolution, the entry points double as moments to welcome new readers and set up the next set of important events for continuing readers. As the series continues and accrues notable characters, these moments can function as times to remind continuing readers of characters who haven't been notable in a while, but who return to be more significant in the next section of the series. After either the initial setup or a new entry point, the small resolutions phase provides a sense of momentum, a way to make sure that each book feels like it matters on its own, not just as a piece in a larger whole. Rosemary and Rue, Book 1, is the initial setup with a small resolution for that particular crisis. A local habitation, Book 2, has small resolutions of its own in a new location. Once October arrives in the county of Tamed Lightning, it's as close to a bottle episode as this series gets. The stakes are life and death and affect the trajectory of the whole county, but it's mostly in retrospect that this book feels so important. On a first read-through, it's a murder mystery in a weird setting that could have felt complete even if none of the characters ever appeared again. In the heightened stakes phase, new villains may appear, older problems may suddenly take on new meaning, or new information may change something important in a way that forces the characters into action. An Artificial Night, Book 3, sets up heightened stakes and, again, has some smaller resolutions of its own. This time, many children are in peril, and Toby ends up killing Blind Michael, one of the firstborn and terror to children for centuries uncounted. Killing Blind Michael proclaims two things. Toby is not someone whose effects can stay small, and she's not predictably cowed by the trappings of a throne, not even that of a firstborn. It's been a very long time since one of the firstborn died, and there are people who already wanted Toby dead who now have an excuse to brand her a murderer and call for her execution. This particular loose end will cause her some trouble in the books to come, but Michael himself won't trouble anyone anymore. When present, the plateau which follows is a time to digest the new information or deal with the aftermath of recent events so that the forthcoming large resolution isn't clogged by loose ends. If the larger resolution will be more logistical, the plateau may address emotional arcs, processing recent changes and assimilating relevant emotions into the character's current mental landscape. If the larger resolution is emotional, the plateau is a time to tidy up necessary logistics so they don't get in the way in the near future. Late Eclipses, Book 4, is a brief plateau, a place to address what's happened so far without introducing too many new threads, wrapping up or giving new context to events in the first 3 books. It's also a time to deal with things allowed to lay fallow too long, such as October's certainty that she is Donya She, when she's actually Dosha She, daughter of a firstborn and something wholly different from almost everyone else in Fairy. This is more of an emotional loose end, since Tybalt had first mistrusted Toby for claiming to be something her scent and her abilities said she wasn't. Then he figured things out for himself, but wouldn't give her those answers. Now, Toby finds out that she is Dosha She, which explains her heightened affinity for blood and her extreme difficulty with illusion magic. Something which should have come easily to the Donya She changeling she understood herself to be until now. After the plateau, or after the heightened stakes in the absence of a plateau, comes the inflection point. This is a prelude to the forthcoming larger resolution, which may or may not also take place in this book, a time for some confrontation to force a change in the characters which will be important for how they approach later battles. They might realize the importance of an ally, the danger of an enemy, or gain new understanding of their resources. Whatever it is, it's important, but the scope of the danger, however large, won't be as earth-shattering as what they still have to face. Reaching the actual finale or large resolution, the characters now have to incorporate the recent arc's changes and apply the lessons from those changes if they are to have any hope of surviving this conflict. If any beloved characters died in the recent inflection point, their deaths will be a motivating force in how the large resolution plays out. One Salt Sea, Book 5, is this combination inflection point and large resolution, more closely tied to the plateau of late eclipses than to the 3 books before this pair. They wrap up some large plot points in a way that makes space for Toby to handle more things in the future, easing the way for the next book to introduce new readers to the series. The thing that changes everything in One Salt Sea is that someone is trying to instigate a war between the Undersea and the Land Fae by kidnapping 2 children from the Undersea. When it becomes clear that the kidnapper is Raceline Torquil, daughter of Toby's liege Sylvester, this leads to a final confrontation once Toby finds the missing boys and fights Raceline to get them out without further harm. Interestingly, Raceline wanted the boys' deaths to force a different confrontation than the one she got. If she'd had her way, they would have died in the inflection point and been the excuse for a bloody and terrible war. Inflection points and large resolutions alike are moments for important character deaths. They are times when any characters who learned insurmountably self-sacrificial lessons or didn't learn the right lessons in the relevant moral paradigm might not survive the story. Unfortunately, in late eclipses, that casualty is Connor, a Selkie whose timing with October never quite worked out. First, he was forbidden by his clan to date someone who wasn't a Selkie, then Toby was dating a human and ended up cursed to be a fish for over a decade. When she returned from the pond, Connor was in a political marriage with Raceline, a woman broken by being kidnapped as a child and held in the dark for a decade. In One Salt Sea, Connor and Toby are finally both emotionally available for a very brief period when Connor's marriage is dissolved due to his wife being a kidnapper and murderer. During the final confrontation, Connor is shot with an arrow and bleeds out while the rest of the fighting wraps up. Things are tidier with him gone, leaving room for Toby's growing closeness with Tybalt to blossom in the books to come, but Connor wasn't just killed off for a romance arc. Some important things related to Selkies and Selkie deaths are explained to Toby in the aftermath of his demise, details which will come back in The Unkindest Tide, Book 12, itself a time for large resolutions. Following the dramatic events of One Salt Sea is the 6th book, Ashes of Honor, as a new entry point. October spends a lot of time with a character who has until now been more of a background figure, only occasionally around, appearing to be traditionalist, boring, and entirely obsessed with propriety. This, of course, is Etienne, one of Sylvester's knights, who mostly stays in Shadowed Hills. It turns out that Etienne has a changeling daughter, and that daughter's powers have manifested in a catastrophic fashion, which threatens all of Fairy if October can't find her in time. As an introduction for new readers, it works pretty well because Toby has to deal with new information, the existence of this changeling, while leaning into her relatively new understanding of herself and what her magic can do now that she's no longer clinging to illusion magic as a mark of her competence or lack thereof. In an effort to not wholly spoil the series so far, I'll quickly list my categorizations for the rest of the books available as of August 2024 when I'm writing this. Ashes of Honor, new entry point. Chimes at Midnight, small resolutions. The Winter Long, heightened stakes. A Red Rose Chain, plateau. Once Broken Faith, inflection point. The Brightest Fell, large resolutions. Night and Silence, aftermath and plateau. The Unkindest Tide, large resolutions part 2. A Killing Frost, even larger resolutions. When Sorrows Come, new entry point. Be the Serpent, heightened stakes. Sleep No More, plateau part 1. The Innocent Sleep, plateau part 2. For the second cycle in this series, starting with Ashes of Honor, Book 6, and culminating in A Killing Frost, Book 14, the events being covered are large enough to require 3 books of large resolutions, with a plateau in the middle to address the first wave of resolutions and changes to the status quo. The 15th book, When Sorrows Come, works as a new entry point because of the way that it's an emotional culmination of the series so far. Logistically, it's also an introduction for new readers of the major players and Toby's current relationships to them. This is especially important because when Be the Serpent, Book 16, heightens the stakes, it will hinge on dramatically upsetting one of those relationships, which could be confusing or less impactful without a recent reminder of what this person means to Toby. For now, at least, I placed Sleep No More, Book 17, and The Innocent Sleep, Book 18, as two halves of the same plateau. They cover similar time spans from two very different perspectives, and while much emotional change occurs, logistically they are a fight to restore circumstances to what they were at the end of When Sorrows Come, to whatever degree is possible, otherwise to near the end of Be the Serpent. Seasons in Inheritance. Turning to Faulkner's Inheritance series, the series is structured into seasons of 5 books each, with 5 seasons planned for an eventual total of 25 books. This means that, in my 6-stage template, the series is more strictly paced and the plateau tends to get skipped or combined with a turning point. In a series like Inheritance with strict arc length, there is neither the room nor the need to take a narrative break for a whole book. This is in contrast to a less strictly paced series such as October Daye, where plateaus are more necessary at intervals just to let the characters adjust and plan before the next major event shakes things up. In Season 1 of Inheritance, Jack of Thorns is the initial setup, containing character introductions and the defeat of the first villains that Lawrence and Quentin will face together. It lays the groundwork for a variety of characters who will become important later, but doesn't come close to introducing absolutely everyone who will matter and is technically around. Night of Flames brings in the teenagers who will be under their care and resolves the issue of the psychic who is keeping the teens with him against their will. It also introduces Freddie, Quentin's twin brother, who was mentioned in the first book. While the issues dealt with feel huge to Quentin and Lawrence, merely one villainous psychic who can be killed by mundane means is a much lower threat than pretty much anything else they'll face this season, let alone the next. Lord of Ravens brings Quentin's father, the Duke of Oxford and Quentin's abuser, to their door in a manner much less metaphorical than Quentin hoped. The teenagers are put in danger, and Quentin has to figure out how to handle things while Lawrence is unable to help for the moment. Reeve of Veils is in some ways a plateau because it goes back into the past and takes place during a time that's already been covered, but it's specifically a major inflection point because it increases the role of Mikey, Lawrence's former drug dealer, and shows that Freddie was up to much more than either Lawrence or Quentin ever suspected while he was helping them deal with Kane. Finally, Page of Tricks forces a confrontation between Quentin and the Duke, with Freddie as a torturous intermediary who eventually is convinced to ally with his twin against their father. Things are forced into a new shape for now, and there isn't yet time to heal. The epilogue teases the next season's villain, but not enough to explain much at this point. Season 2 begins with Rites of Winter, soon introducing Quentin and Lawrence to Basil and John, who will become good friends with them despite their geographical separation. This is a new entry point to the series, showing another side of Otherworld and giving Quentin some new tools to process what he recently learned about his childhood. The main crisis originally appeared to not be connected to the villain teased at the end of Page of Tricks, but he reappears in the epilogue to menacingly convey for the reader that this event was instigated by him, by mysterious means, and for some unknown reason. Sigils of Spring has a lot of pain and some small resolutions. Much of what comes up here is either identified but not solved at all, or is only addressed in a very temporary manner. Spells of Summer heightens the stakes when Lawrence finally has to pay what he owes to his teacher in witchcraft, Rufus, and that alerts him to the existence of the mysterious warlock whom the reader has already met in the recent epilogues. Runes of Fall pretends like it's going to be a plateau, with a trip to Disneyland and a planned excursion to the desert for Quentin, Lawrence, and the teens to practice their powers. The trip to Disneyland mostly goes as planned, with only a minor interruption from an annoying figure. Quentin and Lawrence do get some time to process recent events, but this calm can't last. Unfortunately for everyone, their second planned outing is marred, then completely derailed by the arrival of the book's antagonists, crashing first their gathering, then their helicopter. It is an inflection point in several ways. The most important of these is that the teens learn more about their powers and start to actually work together as a team with Lawrence and Quentin against an outside threat. Nearly as crucial of a change is that Quentin kills someone, instead of relying on Lawrence to do it, accepting that killing might be the only way to stop someone bent on death, destruction, and hate, such as a Nazi demigod with a superpowered hate-mongering crew. Wheel of Fate is a story of large resolutions, finally dealing with the Warlock and showing how various characters have matured since the last season finale, when Quentin, Lawrence, the Duke, Michael, Freddie, and Miriam all worked together to defeat the other Warlock. The last time all these guys were together, the Duke was the one they were trying to stop, and Freddie and Michael were more ambiguously aligned. A balancing act. The combination of series arcs and Monsters of the Week is a robust one. The series arcs provide new and old readers alike with a sense of direction, signposting how the characters are growing and that the series is heading somewhere in a way more complicated than mere power creep. It doesn't matter in a general sense whether the series arcs are rigorously structured, e.g. Inheritance, or flow more loosely as events demand, e.g. October Daye, as they are solutions to the same goal: long-term story scaffolding without stagnation. On a book-by-book basis, the Monsters of the Week keep the series fresh, providing opportunities for some challenges to be handled in a single volume. The mix of the two will give the series a unique feel, becoming something more tangled than can easily be explained, but with access points along the way to welcome new readers.